Marhaba Shabab, this is Ustaz Alex, and I'm going to help us understand what language proficiency is because this is going to be really key to how we develop ourselves in this coming semester. So first we're going to talk about what is proficiency. What is proficiency? When we talk about language learning, people like to talk about being fluent or I know a language, but we need more specific ways to understand that if we're going to talk about actual language learning. So the way that linguists and language teachers have defined this is proficiency. What we mean by proficiency is ability to use language, is the ability to use language in real world situations in spontaneous interaction and non-rehearsed contexts in a manner acceptable and appropriate to native speakers of the language. So notice the emphasis on spontaneous interaction, non-rehearsed contexts. We don't necessarily care whether you can pass a test in your language class by regurgitating what you've already learned. We want to know whether if we drop you from a parachute into a city that speaks Arabic, how well will you be able to manage in situations you haven't necessarily dealt with before. This can be applied to multiple skills, speaking, reading, writing, and listening, but people talk about speaking proficiency a lot, and the reason for that is that speaking is hard because it's a real-time skill where you really have to have not just listening, but you also have to have speaking. You have to think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. So that's one of the hardest. So it's sort of the gold standard. How do we, next I'm going to talk, and this will be what we talk about the longest section of this is how do we measure proficiency, right? So if we've defined proficiency as your ability to use the language spontaneously in the real world, well, that's a pretty broad definition. How can we actually define how proficient a person is? How can we quantify to a certain degree a person's language skills? So you'll see this inverted pyramid a lot. This is the ACTFL guidelines for proficiency, and it goes from the bottom, novice, up to intermediate, advanced, superior, and distinguished, which actually the ACTFL tests don't really give a distinguished rating. They can only go up to superior, but that's not a big important thing. The reason this thing looks like an upside down pyramid is because they're trying to reflect how big a difference it is between each level, right? So look at the novice one, right? If you were to do a calculation of the volume of that little pyramid thing, it's a much smaller volume than the intermediate chunk, and much smaller than advanced, and much smaller than superior. And if you read the descriptions as they go up, right? So novice can communicate with formulaic and rote utterances, lists and phrases. Intermediate can create with language, ask simple questions and familiar topics, and handle simple situation transaction. The jump between those two things is not that big. And in reality, in European languages, a lot of people go from novice to intermediate within the first class or two. In languages like Arabic, we tend to go from novice to intermediate in about 4 semesters. But look at the next one up, advanced. Advanced can narrate and describe in all major time frames and handle a situation with a complication. The jump from being able to ask simple questions and handle a simple transaction to being able to handle a complicated situation where, like, I don't know, you got in a car accident and the guy you're talking to is really mad at you, that's really different than being able to, like, order lunch in a restaurant. Like, the amount of work it takes to get from one to the other is really quite large. And then if you look at the next jump from narration and describing to can support an opinion, discuss topics abstractly, those are all really, really big jumps. So hold in mind that this is one of those kind of scales where it's easier at the beginning to go from one level to another, and it's much harder to go to the next level after that later on. I like to think of things in terms of exercise a lot, because I think it's something that a lot of us have dealt with in some way, shape, or form in our lives. Um, so total beginners, right? You're on your couch. You don't necessarily have a lot of you're not strong, you're not fast, you're not in great shape. Um, right? Novice level, you can, you know, go for a walk. You can maybe do a 5K by the end of the novice level, right? The intermediate level is still more of the same, just better, a little bit longer. So it's more like, you can do a 10K. Advanced is getting closer to being able to do something like a marathon. And superior is like being able to do an Ironman or a triathlon or something like that. each one of these steps is bigger than the previous step, right? Going from being able to do a 5K to doing a 10K is not that big of a jump. Going from a 10K to a marathon is a really big step. Going from doing marathons to learning multiple different kinds of skills is a huge step. This chart is a really nice chart, and I'm going to focus primarily on intermediate and advanced because this is where a lot of you guys are. So the inter excuse me. The intermediate level is really where a lot of students spend a lot of time, and I sometimes think it's the hardest level to be at because you want to say really interesting things, but you just don't have all the stuff you need to say what you want to say. Um, but you can make new meaningful statements. And that's really the big thing. At the novice level, it's really about Anna, min, blah, blah, blah. Anna, beheb, blah, blah, blah. You just sort of take the same old chunks and sort of string them together. Whereas at the intermediate level, sorry, getting over a non-COVID cold. At the intermediate level, you can say things that you haven't said or heard said before. You can make new information. Um, Most of what you talk about are things like your daily life or other people's daily lives. The intermediate level is very still sort of a me, but also you a little bit, and also him a little bit kind of thing. Um, it's still very self-centered often, but as you get more advanced, you tend to get a little broader. Um, it is comprehensible. What that means is you can be understood, but you need to how the people listening to you kind of have to fill in the gaps. And that can be a lot of things. A lot of times it's pronunciation, right? You say enabaru, and the person listening has to say, oh, enabaru, and add in that ha because you were a little bit lazy. They can understand you, but they have to work to understand you. And finally, it's all about sentences at this level, right? You're going to say a sentence. Your sentences might get more complex towards the end of intermediate and starting to be advanced, where you have parts to the sentence, but we're really at the sentence level. I go to school, I study for 3 hours, I come home. Yes, that's a story, but each sentence sort of stands all by itself, and there's no connection to the sentence. You could almost scramble them around, and still each sentence would still make sense all by itself, right? And sometimes you might have strings of sentences where you're like, I go to school, and then I study for 3 hours, and then I come home, but they're still pretty independent. The advanced level is where we start to have um, more detail in what we do, right? So we narrate and describe things in some detail. We can tell a decently long story, and that requires paragraphs, right? It's not just I go to school, I study, I go home. Oh, the other day I was, and then after that, oh, and because of that, I had to. That's the kind of narration you're getting more at the advanced level. You can deal with more complicated situations, right? If something goes wrong, you can figure out how to handle that. You don't just like sort of fall apart. Um, you're not just talking about me anymore. This is really where you've gone from the me and the you to the world, and where you're talking about things like the news and things like stuff you're interested in, or other people are interested, or that's the hot topic in town, whatever. But you're not just talking about yourself anymore. Um, in terms of accuracy and comprehensibility, you are accurate. That is, you are generally understood, you are generally correct in your language, and that means you can be understood by almost anyone. And then finally, um, at the advanced level, you're not talking about sentences anymore, you're talking about paragraphs. And paragraphs mean you have things that introduce paragraphs, that create cohesion between sentences within the paragraphs. And this is really important. This is something that I'm going to talk about a lot. Connectors. Those are the things like, well, firstly, I do, after that, and because of that, I had to. Those kinds of connections are what really help to build up the advanced level versus the intermediate level, where instead of sentences, you have paragraphs that sort of hold together in various ways. And I'll just briefly mention superior. Because advanced high means that you're able to do some of the superior topics, that's really important to know about. We're not necessarily going to be hitting that too strongly this semester, but at the superior level, you go from concrete, right? Like, oh, I heard that somebody got shot last night, to abstract, which is my feeling about gun control is this, and because the nation state needs to consider what it means to have a monopoly on violence, those kind of topics are superior, right? And you can see there's a big jump from advanced to superior. That the way thing I was just saying is probably a higher level of superior than most people, but just talking about the abstract ideas that have no concrete connection to the real world is one of the most characteristic parts of the superior level. So you'll see we'll talk a lot about sublevels. So you can be intermediate low, intermediate mid, or intermediate high. These sublevels basically have to do with how far you are from the previous or the following level. Okay, so intermediate low, it means that you can do all the intermediate stuff, but just barely, right? You never fall into just novice level stuff. If you're an advanced and you're doing a description, it's all paragraphs if you're advanced low. It's all paragraphs, but they're very, 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 very minimal paragraphs, right? They're not necessarily um, strong paragraphs, but you're holding on enough to stay solidly in advanced low or intermediate low or whatever. Um, the mid is the defining characteristic of that level, right? Like if you're intermediate mid, you are great at dealing with simple transactions. You can say sentences and they're good sentences and they can be understood by sympathetic native speakers. And you are very good when you're doing well. If you're in an area you're really familiar with, you might pop up into advanced. You might occasionally have a little bit, pop, you're advanced. But most of the time, you're just a very solid competent person in that level. In advanced mid, you are very solid, very competent at that level. You might occasionally be able to talk about things abstractly, but most of the time, you're pretty concrete, you're pretty standard, and you're very accurate and comprehensible, etc. The high is sometimes called the fallen angel. This is the definition here is a little bit weird and it's kind of counterintuitive sometimes, but basically the idea is you can do most of the time, more than half the time, you're able to do stuff at the next level. But when push comes to shove, when you get flustered or you're on a topic you don't know, or something's just a little off, or you didn't get enough sleep, you fall back onto your previous level. So the difference between a high and a high intermediate and an advanced low is that the advanced low, they're not an advanced mid. They don't do everything right. They don't have this nice detailed paragraph structure. They have basic paragraphs, but they're always doing that. No matter how stressed out they are, no matter how hard the question they just got was, they're still doing it. Whereas an intermediate high means that they aren't quite there, but they could as much as 90% of the time be there. It's just that 10% can knock you down from one level to the next and make you go from a low to a high of the next level down. Um, so there's just a summary of that. Um, so what do we do with this information? We need input in order to create output. Input is the language someone hears, reads, or sees it as meaning bearing and comprehensible, right? Input has to be something that you understand, right? There's a reason you cannot just put on Arabic TV in the background and get good at Arabic because you aren't comprehending it and it doesn't have any meaning to you if you aren't paying attention to it and getting it. This is why you can't just like listen to a tape at night and get better at the language, right? There's some things you might get, but not a lot. Um, Output is the language you produce that's meaning bearing. And again, the distinction between not being meaningful and being meaningful. If you're just chanting verb conjugation charts, that's not really output and doesn't give you any of the benefits of output. But the main idea here is that you get input, you hear how people speak, and then you do a lot of things in your brain, you do a lot of exercises in class or whatever, and then you produce your own new novel speech, right? And it's meaningful. You say something about yourself, right? So if you hear me say, أنا اسمي أستاذ Alex وأنا من مينيسوتا وأنا درست اللغة العربية من 10 سنوات. You can take that in, you process it, you know all those words, and then you say something like, أنا اسمي Sally, أنا من Rhode Island, أنا درست العربي من سنة. It's all the same stuff, but you output something new and novel based on the input that you've gotten. you need to get input on vocabulary and grammar before you can produce output. And when I say input, yes, I can give you a chart of vocabulary and a chart of grammar, and you can try to put them together. But in general, you need to get input that's real, meaningful language. And so that's what we do a lot as language teachers, is we give you that real, meaningful language that you can break apart, understand, and then as you do that, your brain builds up the stuff you need to produce it back out again. Hold in mind, we talk about grammar a lot. You always, when you learn a language, learn about grammar tests, and everyone's afraid of grammar tests. But vocab is always, I would argue, is at all levels, especially in Arabic, much more important than grammar. Um, because there's just so much vocabulary, right? Grammar is a fixed set of things. Vocabulary is an endless set of things, right? People are coming up with new words all the time. So vocabulary is sort of the biggest battle. But if you have to spend an hour of your time and you can spend it on either vocabulary or grammar, spending on vocabulary is probably more productive at all levels of language learning. But as you get more advanced, the more grammar is important and necessary. And by grammar, I don't just mean things that like your teacher tells you, oh, you have to do that. You always have to dot your I's and cross your T's or whatever. I mean things that really make sure that the language makes sense to people, right? Saying things the right way and not saying, talking like Yoda or something. So what do we need to progress to each level? From novice to intermediate, you really need a lot of vocab. At intermediate, you need more vocab. At advanced, you need more vocab, right? The vocab will change. At novice, you need I am from. You need my name is. At the intermediate, you need the names of the major holidays. You need verbs. Intermediate is all verby, especially in Arabic. There's lots and lots and lots of verbs. A little bit and a decent number of nouns, but a lot of verbs, right? I go to the store. Do you have a pencil? Um, where is this, right? Verbs, question words, things like that are really big at the intermediate level. At the advanced level, you're getting more worldwide kind of vocabulary. Announced, heard, um, describe the president, the prime minister. That's the kind of things where you learn more words about things in the world, right? At all levels, you need vocabulary. From at the novice level, you don't need a lot of grammar because a lot of the stuff comes with its grammar already, right? And at ISME, you don't need to know the grammar of that necessarily when you first learn it. When you start to get more to the intermediate level where you're starting to ask people what their name is, right? Then you start to understand, oh, well, ismi, ismek, ismo, all of those things become more important. Um, at the intermediate level, you start to have more needing to know things like, well, how do I conjugate a verb? Um, how do I do possession on nouns? That's where the grammar is more useful, but tons of grammar won't help you all that much. At the advanced level, you need a lot more grammar. And in Arabic, we don't have as much vocab, but you or as much verb conjugation, but you start to need to know the grammar for how to connect parts of sentences together, how to connect parts of paragraphs together, etc. That kind of grammar becomes more important. Um, I just want to really briefly talk about accuracy and comprehensibility. This is really key. When we talk about language classes, we're so used to getting a page covered in red marks, and those are all the inaccuracies. But when we judge people's proficiency levels, we are really thinking about comprehensibility. How much does the listener have to sort of fill in, right? So if you use the wrong word, like Anna Wayne, Minnesota, you really meant Anna Min, Minnesota. And the listener probably knows what you're saying, but if they're not being nice, they have no idea what you said. I'm where, Minnesota, right? Are you asking a question? What's going on? Um, but the key thing here is being understood is more important than being right. And it's important to understand there's different kinds of mistakes you can make, right? If you say the wrong pronoun, that's a lot bigger of a problem. If you ever know someone who speaks English who comes from a language without our pronouns, and they say, um, she came over yesterday, and you've been talking about their boyfriend, you're like, oh, your sister? No, my boyfriend. She came over yesterday. And you're like, what? Oh, you mean he, right? That's a huge mistake. On the other hand, if you have smaller mistakes, like like agreement, for example, if you say hiya tawil instead of hiya tawila, it's pretty clear what you're saying, right? But if you say huwa tawila, are you talking about a guy? Are you talking about a girl? It gets really confusing if you've messed up the pronouns. Only at the advanced level is accuracy start to really become something that they look at in proficiency tests. But you have to start building it from the lower levels. On the other hand, I'm throughout this course going to emphasize more, did I understand you, than are you being accurate, depending on your level. So if we wanted to assess a text, I'm going to have you do this with something you write yourself. Um, I want you to think about all of these things: text type, comprehensibility, accuracy, vocabulary richness, and how public the information is, right? Is it just you, etc. All right. Um, Finally, in terms of this class and how we're going to address this, our class is going to have a lot of different levels of students. This is just the nature of this level of class, the way we've designed the class. And honestly, I've talked to my colleagues in other programs in French and Spanish. They literally will have classes. They've literally tested students all in one class at the 300 or 400 level, where they have students who are intermediate low, and they have students who are advanced high, all in the same class. Um, and so we have to deal with that. And the way we're going to do it is that we're going to do what we call spiraling, which is we're going to work on topics we've worked on before, but we're going to do them using more complex texts than we've worked with before. We're going to do what we do spiraling. So someone who's at a lower level will work on one thing, someone who's at an intermediate level will work on a different thing, and someone advanced will work on a different thing, but they're all going to do it on the same topic, more or less. And this is just to keep my own sanity and to allow us to be compatible with one another so we can describe the things we've learned to students at different levels. But for example, if we do holidays, which we might do this semester, the novice level, you might learn the names of different holidays and different holiday greetings. Some of that probably will be done in English because you can't get that much information at the novice level in Arabic. The intermediate level, you might talk about basic activities during holidays. You might talk about basic aspects of holidays, ask people what they did in their holiday. At the advanced level, you'd be learning about multiple holidays, their relationship to public life, talking about really detailed narrations of what happened, right? And notice the difference between intermediate and advanced here. Intermediate could describe what they did during their holiday, and it would be something like, we woke up at 8, we opened presents, we did, we all talked, and we had Christmas breakfast. At the advanced level, it would be it could be the exact same thing, right? Oh, well, every year we have a tradition where we wake up at 8, and well, the night, actually the night before, we open one present, but on the actual day, we wake up at 8 and we go downstairs at, to open presents before we have any kind of food. And we all open at least one present, right? Notice how that's more of a paragraph. It's more connected. And if we were to be at the superior level, we might talk about, well, how do holiday celebrations interact with secularism, right? Is there a war on Christmas, right? That's the kind of discussion we might have at the superior level. Anyway, the way this class will work is that we're going to have different tasks depending on your level that allow you to start building on the things you need to build on in order to get to a higher level.